Thank you everyone for joining us today and welcoming Joyce Maynard. We are so excited to have such an amazing author with us today and can't wait to hear about her new book, Count the Ways. You can find the link to purchase it here at the toadbooks.com website by clicking the following link in the chat room. Unfortunately, Meredith Hall is not feeling well today, so she will not be joining us. We of course hope that she feels better soon. Joyce Maynard is a New Hampshire native that used to live here in Keene. She is the author of 18 books, including the New York Times bestselling novel Labor Day and To Die For, both adapted for film, Under the Influence, and the memoirs At Home in the World and The Best of Us. Her latest novel, Count the Ways, the story of marriage and divorce and the children who survived it, was published by William Morrow in July 2021. For the duration of Joyce's presentation, we do ask that you keep yourselves on mute, and if you have questions, we will open up for Q&A at the end. If you aren't able to vocalize them, you can certainly type them into the chat and I can relay them to Joyce for you. There you go.
Okay, and Elise, maybe you should mute yourself because I'm hearing a lot of bookstore.
Oh yeah, no problems with that.
Sounds good. Okay, so thank you for joining me. And I will begin by saying how very disappointed I am not to be having this conversation with Meredith Hall, who has written what I consider to be one of the finest novels I've read in the last number of years, Beneficence, which is just out in paperback. Meredith also has strong ties to New Hampshire. She taught at UNH for many years and spends her summers in the state of Maine, but is currently in California and under the weather. So I'm here, and at this point, Count the Ways came out in the summer, and I'm always happy to talk about that book and to answer questions you have about that book. But I'm also happy to, especially at this stage, go beyond that book and hear what's on your minds, either about other books or the writing process, or books, the function of books in our lives today. Big topic, important one. I'm always happy to read from the book, but I think I'm actually just going to begin by throwing this out to all of you. This is a nice informal gathering. Everybody's made the choice not to be out Christmas or post-Hanukkah shopping. So I'm guessing there's a reason why you tuned in, and if so, share with me and with all of us what it is, and let's talk. No need to be shy. I will tell you that my only regret about this line of work that I've devoted the last 50 years to, it has been my entire career of my adult life writing, is that it's a very solitary act, writing a book, writing an essay, writing a story. And I'm actually rather a sociable person. So for me, these kinds of moments when I get to hear back from you, I always feel my books are one half and one half only of a conversation. And please don't, there's no such thing as a bad question or a wrong question. Feel very free to offer whatever's on your mind. Yeah, Sharon. Sharon, where are you coming to us from?
Kingston, New Hampshire, which is right next to Exeter.
Oh, don't I know? Of course I know. I grew up in Durham.
I think I'm one of your biggest fans because we took dance class together at the Grange Hall in Durham.
Oh my goodness.
I don't remember if it was the movement class or if it was the ballet class with Madame Cordova.
Madame Cordova,
Yeah.
Don't I know? Actually, I was a Madame Cordova dropout. I'm more of a modern dance type. So I went across the street to Judith Jacobs, but you'll forgive me if I don't remember. My Madame Cordova days were brief.
So as soon as you published the book, an 18-year-old looking back at the world, I read that, and I was an English major in college at the time, and I saw so many things that I knew exactly what you were talking about, that I think that's made me your best fan because I've read every single thing that you've ever written since, and all my friends send me your magazine articles.
Oh, that's a little scary thought, I have to tell you, Sharon, that you've read everything, because there's a lot of things.
Well, no, I haven't. I don't think I've read everything.
Good,
but I've read
good.
most
Keep it that way.
And let me think now. This meeting of the two of you is like kismet, because I wrote this down. I read Count the Ways in August. Then I reread Under the Influence in October, because the book group that I'm in, I had suggested you as an author and they chose that. And so I reread that. And then they sent out a list of ideas for 2022, and Beneficence was on it. Well, I'd been looking for a second book by Meredith Hall for about 10 years, and I couldn't find one. And I thought, oh my Lord. So I just finished Beneficence. And I thought that the review that you wrote on Amazon just took my breath away. And I read that after I actually finished the book. And then this popped up. So it was
well, it's a fabulous novel. We both, Meredith and I have actually never met in real life, but we share so much common ground. And, you know, we both wrote novels about a family and set in New England, and about small town, rural life on a farm, and a huge family loss involving a child. So I sort of forget that we haven't actually met, because we've had the most wonderful conversations on the phone and a couple of times in these bookstore chats. But I think that novel's going to make a wonderful book group choice. It's one of those books that came out, got a little bit lost because it came out during the pandemic. So I've been talking it up whenever I can.
Hi, Joyce. This is Joann. I too am a great fan.
Hi, Joann. Where are you coming from?
I'm coming to you from Peterborough.
Great.
I actually came to your house sale in Keene when you left.
Oh boy, that was some sale. What did you come home with? I should explain for everybody who wasn't at my yard sale. In 1996, when I made the decision after 42 years in the state of New Hampshire to pull up stakes and move to California, I put a giant sign on the front of my house that says, "Everything must go." I didn't quite mean that, because I'm actually rather attached to possessions, but we had a giant yard sale, as you know, Joann. In fact, the police ultimately cordoned off the block. There was so much traffic. And even now, when I'm back in New Hampshire, which I do every summer, I spend the summers in New Hampshire, I will see my possessions at people's houses. It's a little bit like having your ashes scattered before you've died.
I also have that problem because I imbue meaning to inanimate objects. Like if I got this in France, I'll hang on to it for generations.
I am hopeless. I'm here in this little apartment in New Haven, and I said that I was going to just have this very austere life with just, you know, a bed and a desk, but I've somehow managed to accumulate all kinds of stuff. I guess you can't.
Well, I was also an original subscriber to Domestic Affairs when you got that letter. I'm fascinated because I feel like I know so many details about your life that I too try to read most of your books, and some of the things that in Count the Ways, I wonder if they were autobiographical.
Absolutely. And you know, I never pretend otherwise. I was reading, I really don't sit around and read all my Amazon reviews, but there was one that I saw a few weeks back. Somebody had said, well, this novel is just really about her life. So this, you know, what was this? I know these stories. I think any honest writer will tell you that their books are inspired by their life experience, whether they are as openly connected or connected through our themes and obsessions. But probably more than any work of fiction I've created before, it's easy to draw connections between the story I tell in Count the Ways, which follows a family living on a farm in New Hampshire over the course of 4 decades, raising 3 children, a couple who start out with a big, hopeful, idealistic dream, fall in love, want to raise children on a farm, and gradually fall apart. And that, as anybody who read Domestic Affairs or other work of mine knows, is a piece of my story. I married an artist, had 3 children, was raising them on a farm, and our marriage ended when my children were still quite young. So that part is true, as is the ongoing grief and regret over the death of the big dream of making that marriage. That said, not everything. In fact, at its core, I would say Count the Ways is absolutely a work of fiction. And I took pains to make sure that the children in this book were not my children. I'm relieved to say that the terrible accident that takes place in the novel never was a part of my story. I am not the parent of a transgender child, which is one aspect of this story, one aspect only. It's not a book about a transgender child, but one of the children realizes when she is growing up, she never feels she's inhabiting the right body and ultimately transitions. I think what's at the core most connected to my life is my obsession with family, and the obsession that I think many of us share if we have children, of wanting to protect our children and the impossibility of doing that. The central character, Eleanor, like me, is terrified at her own pain. Her own loss is not the scariest thing anymore. It's the possibility of something happening to her children. And the awful truth is, which she comes to understand, is that there is no protecting them. Hard things will happen. And we have to accept that and stand back and trust that they will be strong enough to survive them. This novel, as you will know if you've read the book, the novel begins with a story about a tradition that Eleanor has in her family of every spring, when the snow is just starting to melt, she and they live down their farm is just down the road from a brook. And every spring when the snow first melts, the brook runs very fast. And she and her children have this tradition of making little people out of corks and putting them in little paper boats and sailing them down the brook. And it's kind of, I did that with my kids, and Eleanor does it in this book, following the corks down the river and watching them bob along, and sometimes seeing them capsize and disappearing, which is kind of a metaphor for parenthood. You give birth to these people who matter more to you than anything in the world, and you launch them in their little boat, and you run alongside the edge of the water, but you cannot always rescue them. In fact, the book actually was originally called The Cork People, but my editor thought that was just too weird and nobody would understand, or they would think it was a book about Ireland. So its name changed. But if you read Domestic Affairs, you would find even particular moments that I chronicled in that nonfiction column coming back to life in this work of fiction. There's a moment in the novel when Eleanor is throwing a birthday party for her 7-year-old daughter, Ursula, and one of the gift that is Ursula's favorite gift is a kind of Barbie that comes with a very special clear plastic shoe. And Eleanor takes one look at those shoes and she can sort of anticipate the trouble that could come, which is that the shoe could get lost during the confusion of the party. And she urges Ursula to set the shoes away, but at the end of the party, the shoe is gone. And Eleanor, the mother, tears the house apart trying to find the shoe in the name of trying to protect her child, of course, to save her child grief. And of course, the irony is that her child experiences more grief watching her mother go crazy than she would have if she simply lost a Barbie shoe.
Joyce,
Hi, Nora.
I have to tell you something. Because I hear you, because when Well, I did tune in because I'm alone and I love hearing authors talk. And I heard you in
And Nora is one herself, it should be said, a fine
well,
wine.
and you are a wonderful teacher. If anyone's ever taken one of Joyce's writing classes, whether published or unpublished, I still use and think about the things you taught.
Oh,
But
that's actually Judy, who's up in the corner, is a
Mhm.
former student, and Leslie is coming to Guatemala this March.
it's and just those little tidbits I never forgot. But I have to tell you something that might make you feel a little better, because every time I hear you sort of seem to need to qualify why you used your life or why you used it again, I have to tell you what Ellie told me, Eleanor Littman,
Mhm.
early on, because she said, you can plagiarize your own life as much as you want.
Yeah, it's yours. I
It's
agree.
yours. And I loved that. It just gave me total permission.
It's actually, I have to say before I move on, that I didn't acknowledge two other writing students that are with us, Jude Swankowski and Robin Mencher, also have been to Guatemala. This is a very Guatemala-oriented group. You know, one of the gifts of writing fiction is to take the stuff that actually happened and either reimagine it or honor it. In the case of Count the Ways, I reimagined the story of a divorce and some of the things that didn't happen but could have or maybe should have. It's looking at the fork in the road, and it, you know, we don't always have control of what happens in our lives, but when we write our fiction, we can control what happens. In the case of my memoirs, which of course are very clearly taken from my life, I don't change, I don't alter the story, but in the act of telling the story, I can give it meaning. You know, when my most recent book before this one was a memoir called The Best of Us, about finding and then losing my very good second husband, my husband Jim. And I remember somebody saying, you know, oh, she's even exploiting her. That, you know, there are people who are going to find fault with whatever you do. She's exploiting her husband's death. I would say exactly the opposite. I wanted to honor what had been lived and to capture an experience that was brutally painful in a way that that memorialized it. And I guess I'd say that I do that whether I'm writing fiction or nonfiction. I wanted to capture some what are to me essential truths about marriage and divorce and family life and parenthood. And thank you for that, Nora. Yeah, I feel the same. It is your life. You get to use it as you need to. We have paid a price for that.
Well, I think she used the word plagiarism, like the irony of it was just perfect. So
Yeah.
go for it. If I disappear, it's because I'm going to get food and I don't want to eat in front of you. So I'm going to work.
Okay. Thanks for explaining. It's okay. Who else has something on their mind? Elizabeth, hi. Elizabeth, maybe you're muted. Can't hear you yet. It's usually the lower left-hand corner.
How about now?
Yeah, now we hear you. Good. Where are you coming to us from?
Well, I don't live here, but I'm coming from Charlotte, North Carolina.
Okay. I hear it in your voice.
I will also be flying to Guatemala.
I know it. I know it.
So excited.
Me too.
What I wanted to ask you was about Andover the other day.
Exeter.
Well, that's part of my question. I was living in Savannah, Georgia at a time when my colleague peers were going off to boarding school. And they always said, you know, where are you going? I'm going to Andover. It was the terms were interchangeable, unless there's
it's a little bit like, you know, for those who tuned in from New Hampshire, people who don't live in New Hampshire will often see New Hampshire and Vermont used. Gary is nodding. You know, people will say, Howard say to me, "Oh, how are things in Vermont?" And I'll say, "New Hampshire." But if you live in New York, it might be. So I went to, for those who are not my Facebook friends, I was invited to give what is called a meditation at Phillips Exeter Academy, where I was a student for 1 year and 1 year only, my senior year, when the school, after more than 200 years of existence, decided to admit girls, women we were called, but I was really a girl at that point. And I wanted to explore a very painful story involving a teacher of mine who was really dear to me and important, inspirational to me. I would call him the best English teacher I ever had. And he was the first person outside of my family who really made me feel that I could be a writer. Having said that, I will add that when at the age of 18, in my first year of Yale, I'd left Exeter by this time, I received the letter from Salinger that ultimately led to my correspondence with him and then my going to see him. Salinger had read something I wrote and wrote me a letter and then a whole series of utterly captivating letters that were a pretty heady thing for an 18-year-old to receive. It was my English teacher from Exeter who drove me to meet him and spend the weekend with him. And this 25 years later, when I finally gave myself permission to tell the story of what had happened with Salinger, I approached my English teacher and asked him if he would talk with me about that year that I'd spent in almost total isolation, but he had seen me, and as such, it was a very precious thing. And he would have nothing to do with that project. He actually was one of the first people to give voice to a point of view that I have heard many times in the years since, which was that I had no right to tell this story about a very important man who only wanted to be left alone. P.S., but wrote letters to young girls. And if that sounds harsh, it is harsh. So my very good and dear and trusted teacher let me down in profound ways. I did obviously write the book anyway, but without his blessing. And when the book was published, which was 1998, real pre-Me Too days, I was greatly condemned for publishing that book, for telling that story. Many years later, last winter, that teacher, now retired, having spent his entire career at Phillips Exeter, was the subject of an investigation at the school for a report, a 25 or 30-year-old, a report just coming to the surface of an instance in which he had behaved inappropriately with a student. He had hugged her and given her a kiss. That teacher probably gave me a hug and a kiss at some point during my young days at the school, and I know what that hug and kiss was, and it was not sexual. But one piece of the fallout of the very necessary reevaluation of how teachers and students interact and when harassment and abuse occurs is that not that everybody gets thrown into the same boiling water. And a letter was sent out to tens of thousands of Exeter students, alumni, people like me who've been gone from that school for 50 years, informing us that he had been stripped of his emeritus status and banned from the campus at the age of 78. This man, who was a fine teacher who dedicated his life to the school, had been banned from the campus. So I was invited to give a meditation, and I briefly considered all kinds of safe topics about, co-education and advice to young people as they're heading off to college and blah, blah, blah. I could talk about those things. But on my drive over to Exeter 3 days ago, I decided that I really wanted to tell that story, because if there was anybody who would have reason to find fault with that man, it would be me. He let me down in in profound and troubling ways many years ago when I turned to him when I was writing my book. But in fact, what I wanted to say is that there is a lot of nuance not afforded the Me Too story now. And specifically, in no way do I mean to diminish the seriousness of the need for change, but specifically because I take it seriously, I'm really troubled at the sort of the broad brush we're using for everything. So that's what I did. That's a long answer to a short question, Elizabeth, maybe
That wasn't the
longer than
question
you.
yet.
But I went to Exeter and the principal who had sent out this letter was sitting about 6 feet away from me.
That's what I want to hear about, is like
And
what when you got
I
down
I
to that
kind of
dial.
knew as I saw him sitting there that I would probably never be asked back to that school. And that's okay. Part of the choices that I've made for my life have been that I will, having once been a person who really sought to please and make everybody happy and be a good girl, I am true to myself now.
Me too.
And it has taken a few decades to get to this place where I can truthfully say, if the principal of Phillips Exeter Academy is offended by me, I won't lose sleep over it.
So they didn't call security to escort you
No,
from
they did
the-
not. They did not. He had a mask covering the lower portion of his face, so I didn't see his expression. But he was cordial to me. He didn't say anything about what I had just done. In the scale of what's going on in the world, it was a very small moment, but it was a significant moment for me. And I think it was a significant moment for that teacher who was not allowed to be there, of course.
Well, I thank you. And I did not mean to open the can of worms that is JDS.
Oh, it's okay. It's, I don't start twitching and crying.
God, but I mean, it's like every interview, everything.
Well,
like,
it is true. It is.
voluntary.
I was when Count the Ways came out, I was the object of one interview. The interviewer came over, and I was looking forward to talking about my book and my characters and writing and so many things: families, divorce, children, marriage, love, loss. And he opened it with Salinger. And I said, you're talking to a 60, at that point I was 67, I'm now 68, a 67-year-old woman who has published 18 books, raised 3 children, lived decades out in the world. Is the only thing of interest to you the famous man I was with when I was 18 years old?
He's your albatross.
Can we? Only if I let him be. Only if I let him be, and I don't.
Good. Thank you.
Sarah. Sarah. I think you're muted, Sarah.
Yep, I got it.
Got it.
I loved reading that whole thing you did 3 days ago and read it with fascination, because there's someone else, I can't remember who, but a girl who published a book. I read it in audio form about a situation at a private school.
St. Paul's, I think.
Yeah. And so I know how prevalent all of that stuff was. But one thing I really liked is that you didn't know what you were going to say until you almost got up there. And I've had that experience before where it's been a very important time to say something and you get it all and you knew it was going to happen. And so you planned it all out and thought of something, like you said, neutral or encouraging or whatever. And then you got up there and you said something totally different. I had a really interesting experience once where I was sexually abused as a child for many, many years. And the man had died, but the wife hadn't died yet. And it wasn't my father. When she died, I found out about it and I was invited to go to her funeral. And I was really, really scared. But I wanted to. I had this desire to, and I wanted to be able to say something, if at all possible, because she was not in on anything that happened. And So it was in a church and I sat in the back row. And when I came in a minute late, everybody turned around. They said, "Oh, it's Sarah." And I thought, "Oh no, what's going on?" And then after the people said their little eulogies, they asked if anybody wanted to come up and say something about this woman.
Whoa.
And I really did, but I was so scared. And I thought, "Oh, what could I say?" What I didn't have anything prepared. And then, sorry, her nephew got up, who I hadn't seen in gazillion years, and he said something beautiful. And then it was going to be over. And I thought, no, I got to do it. So I raised my hand, and they asked me to come up. And I ended up being able to say something really, really good about the person, good memories, and how much I cared for her, and nothing about what happened. And at the end, it was just so great because people came up to me and thanked me so much. And then one person asked if I would give them a copy of what I wrote and all this kind of stuff. And then also at the reception afterwards, I found another girl that what I knew had been abused by him as well. And it was secret. And yet I knew from the things she said. And we both had a very common experience. So I really liked it when you just said, that you didn't decide right away, and you have to just go with your gut and do it and be scared and just do it.
I will say that when I write a book, I don't do that. I
No,
do think
no,
it
no,
out.
no.
And I think that's important. But,
No, but what you did in that situation was really good.
thank you.
Joyce, can you talk more about your writing process?
Sure. Who's asking that question?
Joann.
Joann, sure. Well, it's, as long as I've been doing this, it's new every time, Joann. I don't begin with a topic. I don't begin with events. I begin with characters. And I think about who the people are that I want to spend the next year, year and a half, 2 years of my life with. I've actually learned that one from the one book I wrote that it was a true crime book that had no characters that I liked, and I'll never do that again. I want to find some goodness even in people who make poor choices for their lives. And in fact, I sort of pride myself on never having a villain in a book of mine. I have complicated people who sometimes make bad choices and hurt people, but they've all got their story. Maybe that's a lesson I've learned from teaching memoir for as long as I have. So right now, for instance, I'm writing the sequel to Count the Ways. And I know these characters very well because I've written 500 pages about them, but I have to think about what they're going to do next. And I don't sit down and imagine events. I think about who these people are and what they want and what their problems are, what gets in the way. I know that Eleanor has a difficult relationship with her younger daughter, who's now actually her only daughter since the transition of one of her other daughter. And I think, what's she going to do about that? She has a daughter that she loves who is still angry and bitter towards her over events that happened 20 years before. Where does she go from there? I think about the character of Toby, who's the boy who suffered a brain injury when he was 5 years old. Well, he's now 35, and he's living back on the farm, and he's raising goats and living this quiet, gentle, loving life, narrower life than the one that he would have had if he hadn't suffered his brain injury. And I think about a 35-year-old man and know that he probably wants love in his life, and he wants connection, and he probably wants a sexual relationship. What's he going to do about that? What's going to happen? And those are the kinds of questions. I have questions like that about every single one of my characters. the book ends with Cam, the ex-husband, having a very serious health problem. It's going to turn out to be cancer. So the whole constellation of the family is going to be changed by the fact that he will not survive it. And when that happens, more things will happen as a result. The woman he used to be married to is going to come back to the farm, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's that's a quick answer to a big question that you asked, Joann. But I will say that as different as my novels have been, every one of them has started with questions that I've had about what about human behavior. I'm endlessly fascinated. It's why I can never be bored with the work I do. Every book sets out a new set of characters and questions. And, when I wrote To Die For, it was loosely inspired, loosely only, by a murder case that was quite a famous one going on in New Hampshire at the time. In fact, I was living in Keene at the time, the Pamela Smart case. And the part that most interested me when I read about that in the newspaper was the 15-year-old boy who had been enlisted by the beautiful, older, very seductive, married teacher to kill her husband. He'd never had sex. He was obsessed with her. And she said, we can be together and we can do this all the time if you get my husband out of the way. I remember when I read about that case thinking, how does a 15-year-old boy shoot a man point blank that he doesn't even know? And either he's a monster and a psychopath, which is not a very interesting character, or I'm going to create a character and let him live for a while on the pages of the book and give him a mother and a home, or the absence of a home, and a troubled past and all sorts of other things. It doesn't excuse murder, but by the time I got to the scene in that book, which was probably about 150 pages in, where the boy pulls the trigger, I understood where it came from. And that, to me, that is the magic of the writing process. Not just that I write what I know, but that in the act of writing, I discover things I didn't know how things.
That's what I wanted to ask. In the process of finding out what your characters want, do they take on a life of their own?
Absolutely. That's exactly the phrase I use. They take on a life of their own, and they lead me. And I honestly, Count the Ways tells a story that is about a family, 5 members of a family, the 3 children and the husband and the wife. And even after the marriage breaks apart, they are very connected. These people are going to be connected all their lives. They have children together. So at the end of the book, they come back together for the wedding of one of the children. And at this point, both Cam and Eleanor, the original couple who created this family, are single and unattached and have had a lot of hard things happen in their lives, romantic lives, with each other and with other people. And I know there would be readers who would just want them to get back together and be happy. I can't do that. I cannot manufacture happily ever after. That's unbelievable. But I wanted to provide some kind of believable redemption or peace. And I didn't know what it was going to be. I was 20 pages away from the end, and I didn't have a clue what these 2 people were going to do when they met up at this wedding. And then it became clear what, of course, they would do. And I didn't think it up. They sort of led me to it. It could sound like hocus pocus, but it's not really.
Joyce, I wanted to thank you for all of your learning that I've done since I went to Guatemala. It was a process that stayed with me, even though at that time I hadn't written very much. And
I
at the
remember.
time, it was very overwhelming to do it. But I remember you're saying also about how every word is worth $1. And it's helped me to really edit. And I've gotten into a writing group now.
Oh, I'm so happy to hear that.
Yeah, and it's really, what's great about this group of around 7 to 10 people is we send each other our writing, and it's basically fiction or a memoir. And we end up telling each other what we think, not just, oh, it's good, it's this, but sort of what you did. We take it and we go through it and we say, you could redo it this way and you could do that, or this is what I think we got from it. And it's wonderful. And I really, thank you also for your talk you had with Joyce Carol Oates, because I love her. And
Oh,
I just
that was a
enjoyed that.
fabulous encounter. Incidentally, for anybody who missed that, I think you can, if you Google my name and Joyce Carol Oates, it's
Yeah.
online, and it was a really wonderful conversation.
Yeah, I
She's
really
somebody
enjoyed
I'd
it.
admired for so long.
And I've just keep looking back at my notes from it, and I learned so much from that group. But I was wondering, like, you do memoir, are you ever going to do more also fiction writing in terms
You know, I really feel, I'll tell you how I feel about teaching fiction. I've actually written more fiction at this point than memoir, at least in terms of books. I steer clear of teaching fiction because I don't ever want to be the person who throws cold water on somebody's beloved project. And I'm aware of the possibility that somebody could come to a workshop with a 300-page novel that I just couldn't see how to make work. And I cannot lie. But if the characters don't ring true, if the story is unbelievable, then there's nothing I can do to fix that. And I have to be honest. I can't just say, "Oh, keep up the good work," and on to the next. But if somebody comes to a workshop, and it's why I often say to people, people say, "I'm not a writer," and I say, "It doesn't matter. You can come to my memoir workshop because everybody has a story." And I can never say to that person, "I don't believe this story," because it's your story. It happened. The challenge is making me understand how it could have happened and what it felt like and what it meant. So I also believe that the act of writing memoir will deliver reward no matter what happens. If you never get an agent, if you never publish it, if nobody ever reads it, the act of putting down the story well, and I do not mean just sort of vomiting it out on the page, which is what is recommended in some quarters, never by me, that in itself will be a meaningful event and a meaningful experience, and there'll be no wasted time, no wasted money, no wasted effort. So I won't say I'll never teach fiction, Judy, but I'm far less likely to teach fiction than memoir because I so believe, I do think, incidentally, that if a person is interested in fiction, they can still get a whole lot from studying memoir, whether it's with me or somebody else, because it's always going to be about how to tell a story. Somebody's just texted in a question. Carrie Kback says, I can't read this question. Here we go. "My first book started out as a memoir, but I rewrote it as fiction, mainly because many of the characters were still living. Fiction also allowed me more freedom somehow. What are your thoughts on being open and honest when it comes to still living characters?" Well, Carrie has just named the big question, the question that comes up at every single workshop. How can I write honestly and still, get invited to Thanksgiving dinner or whatever the equivalent is, not be written out of the will? And I can't make that choice for anybody but myself, but I will say that I believe nobody should be able to tell you you cannot tell the story you have lived. You probably paid dearly for many of your experiences. There are not too many areas in life where we know true freedom, but we should know it when we pick up our pen or put our fingers to the keyboard, and we should be able to tell the truth. And as a person who grew up in a family of dazzlingly articulate people who never talked about the big thing that was going on in our family, namely that my father got drunk every night, I am much more concerned with the damage of silences than with the things we talk about. I believe in shining a light on the hard stuff and opening up the conversation. That's not to say I'll just sort of run fast and loose with people's lives that, other than me. And I do have a code of things that I will not write about and never have and never will. You only know the things I do write. You don't know what I don't write. But and often it has to do with children who deserve and will receive from me a different level of protection. But did I have a right to write about a 53-year-old man who wrote letters to me as an 18-year-old girl suggesting I drop out of college and move in with him? Well, many people said I did not have the right to do that. I feel differently. And obviously, one could say much more about that. And at my workshops, I do. Does Joyce feel Pam Smart should be pardoned, says somebody. I don't, I have never pretended to be an expert on the Pam Smart case. So my answer to this question will not be based on the particulars of that case and her guilt or innocence, but I will say, I think a woman who has served more than half of her life in prison for a crime for which the men who actually pulled the trigger on the gun have long since been let free deserves to go free. Yeah, she is not a threat to society.
Joyce, can I say something else?
Yes, of course, Nora.
I just feel like while we're here someone was speaking about whether you would teach fiction or not.
Yes.
And you were saying, you're teaching writing. You're just basically teaching writing.
I am teaching writing. That is the case.
Tell you, yeah, there was something you taught me. I took your class at Sarah Lawrence, and it was many,
many years ago and many books ago, Nora. You have published how many books?
15.
15.
But my first adult novel is in the works. But this is what you taught me. And I share this with everyone. You know how when you do that thing where you take lines from everybody's work, you take great lines and you take, I don't know, for lack of a better word,
yes, I call it, can you draw a picture of this? Yeah.
And will you read them and nobody knows whose story you've pulled them from? You just read them over and over. And you read mine when you were reading the ones that don't work. Mm-hmm. And I had a sentence that said she was something to the effect of, she was crying so hard the tears came out of her face and landed on her and bounced off her jeans. And you said to me, do tears bounce? Like if a tear hit your blue jeans, would they bounce?
Yeah.
And I learned from then on, never, no matter how poetic you're trying to be or how emotional you're trying to be, is that really what you mean? Are their eyes really, shooting for whatever it is?
That is straight from my mother, Nora. If you've read At Home in the World, you know that I was raised in a boot camp of writing. And that's the kind of stuff I got from my mother every day of my life from age 5 on, maybe younger. I did not replicate this with my own children, incidentally, but I can hear my mother's voice saying, and she would be very, very particular about a metaphor you used, and it had better work. You can lose your reader so easily with inauthentic language or images. So, yeah. And incidentally, when Judy quoted me as saying, $1 a word, what I actually mean when I say that is the opposite of what that might have seemed. It's, in the old days when I wrote for magazines, I would be paid based on how many words were in the piece. And so you might think that would inspire one to fatten up the piece and have more words. But in fact, what my mother always said to me was, write as if every word cost a nickel. This was in the 50s and 60s, she said that. So I now say, write as if every word costs $5. And when I go through a manuscript, it's slash, 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 slash. And I take particular pleasure. It's actually a very satisfying experience to add up how many dollars I can save you by just removing words. Yeah. Yeah. Sarah.
That was something I loved about Count the Ways, is how short the chapters were. I just loved that format, and I've been waiting for you to do that. So it was great.
I wrote for years in the space of a child's nap, and I wrote a newspaper column for about 10 years that I'd sort of fit in between my, the raising of my 3 children. So my writing tended to be short.
I like that as well as Joann, because it's almost like a scene in a movie. It's very action oriented. And
it's funny that you say that, Joann. When you asked about my process, and I will say something else about my process. I imagine when I sit down to write, I picture myself making a movie, which is a career I would have loved probably in another era. But in fact, I'm making the lowest budget movie that there is. And the movie is going to play in your head. Amy, when you open up a book of mine, I want a movie to come to life in your mind. And I want you to see those scenes and those characters. And I want you to hear their voices. And I want you to see the way the light comes in the window. And I want you to, I'm the director of the movie, of course. I'm the movie star. I'm the screenwriter, excuse me, but I'm also the film editor, and I'm the cinematographer. I know when the camera moves in close and when it pulls back, and I do the soundtrack, and I do the lighting and do the costumes. And it's a way to keep me honest and clear. When you're watching a movie, there's no line at the bottom of the screen that says, here comes a bad guy, or this woman and this man are going to fall in love, or this man is going to betray this woman. We have to understand those things from the behaviors of the actors on the screen. And that's really what I want to do in my writing too. I have developed vast and ever-growing respect for the intelligence and perception of readers from publishing my work for as long as I have. I don't need to tell you. I don't need to give you the bottom line of interpretation. I will show you the scenes and let you figure out what they mean. Yeah, Amy. You're muted, Amy.
Okay.
And I know
hi,
Amy's
Joyce.
coming to us from Kansas.
Yeah. Hi, I joined in late. I'm sorry. We were Zooming with our kids in New York and England, and the time got away. But one thing I wanted to ask you 2 things. A long time ago, you posted a list of books that people that have participated in your workshops have published.
Yes.
And I would love to see that list again, because I didn't save it. So if it's something that's at your fingertips.
Oh gosh, I'd have to reconstruct it, but clearly Nora has added a lot of titles to that list now. It's never my number one objective at a workshop to get to, I don't ever measure somebody's success as a writer by whether they've published their work. And when we go around the circle at a workshop and, somebody will say sort of apologetically, I've never published my work, that's not the defining measure for me about whether somebody's a writer or not. Plenty of really bad writers do publish work, and plenty of really good writers don't. And I always say at my workshops that the best way I know to help a writer get their work published is to help them be a better writer. So I don't talk about getting agents and writing query letters. I focus on the work. But over the years, a lot have published work, and I take huge joy in that. Just huge joy, as much as my own work.
Well, I read one that I think you mentioned by Holly Dexter Fisher, or Holly Fisher Dexter.
Yeah.
Fire Season. And it was such a fantastic book.
And yeah, she's a wonderful writer.
And she actually just had people that were interested read one of her manuscripts and give back criticism. So
Wow.
I volunteered and I read her most recent manuscript, which is now at the publisher. So that was pretty cool.
Wow.
And the other thing I wanted to tell you though, is when I read your books, I just can relate to, you know, at least one character and usually more. And they're always such nice and good people, even if they have their problems. And I think that's why I enjoy your books so much. And they're page turners because you want to find out what's going to become of these people that you really care about. Because you
Well,
mentioned that you
that's
don't
what gets
have
me to my desk every
villains.
morning at 5 a.m. I want to know too. I never know the ending of a book of mine. So
Yeah.
I write to find out.
Yeah. And it's just nice to read a book where you like the people and you really care and you really get involved in their lives.
Thank you.
And
Thank
I really enjoy that about your books.
I feel moved to ask. I don't want to single you out here, Gary, but you are the only man in this screen. Oh no, Brendan. I just saw Brendan Anderson, but I'm going to ask you, Gary, because some people would assume, oh no, and Tom, I'm sorry, we've got several men. There would be a school of thought that would say that a writer whose focus is family, relationships, marriage, children, love, that would be a writer for women. I think that does a great disservice to men to suppose that men aren't interested in those things. But I'd just like to ask you, Gary, what brought you here today? And I'll ask this question to Tom and to Brendan as well, because I'd like to think that I am a writer for all genders.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I hear you great.
Okay. I will just take up 60 seconds of Zoom time to explain why I'm such a fan of yours.
And I wasn't
also,
fishing for compliments, I should say.
And also, and in doing that, I'll answer your question. I've been a fan for half a century.
Whoa.
I remember like
Is it possible that you were born in 1953, Gary?
1954. I'll be 68 in a little while. There are a lot of parallels in our lives. I grew up on a lake in New Hampshire and everything.
Oh, but which lake? Which lake?
Sunapee.
Sunapee. I've swum in them all.
Yeah, and I still go there, even though I live in San
Oh,
Monica,
lucky
California now. But I remember like it was yesterday, the day that the article appeared in the New York Times Magazine, and my friends and I in our college dorm were hysterical. We were like, who is this 18-year-old girl? How the hell does she get published in the New York Times Magazine? Oh my God. And then we sat, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And I had the presumption to talk about my generation, meaning you, which I would never do now.
Right. So then we sat down to read it and people were like, hey, this is good stuff. And by the end of it, people were saying, she's very irritating, but she's really nailed it. And she really has. She's really nailed it.
They still say I'm pretty irritating in some quarters.
And that's why they gave her the chance to write this article. She nailed it in a way that nobody else in our generation
Well,
really
I'll
has.
tell you, I mean, I was raised by my mother. I don't think it would be possible to have grown up in that house and not know how to write. And my sister is a fine writer. I sometimes share her work on my Facebook page, as those of you who are my Facebook friends know. But I will tell you the story of how that article came to be. I had been writing for quite a few years. Since I was 14, I was writing for 17 magazine, and I was very ambitious. And I was ambitious for my mother, really. My mother never got to have the career she deserved. And that was a function of being a wife and mother of the 1950s. Highly educated, brilliant woman who couldn't get a job and sold encyclopedias door to door and tutored Latin for $1 an hour because my father had the job. And I always felt a responsibility to sort of to deliver the kind of acknowledgement and success that had eluded her. So I began writing for 17 when I was very young. And I used to take the bus into New York City and meet with the editors at 17 and pitch story ideas to them. I was too shy to like talk to a boy, but I could go and meet with the editors of 17 in New York City and put on my outfit, you know. And so they sent me to the White House to interview Julie Nixon Eisenhower, and they sent me to a camp for chubby girls to learn how to lose weight. And, you know, I did a series of articles for them. And then one day I suggested that they let me write about the Miss Teenage America pageant. This was in the fall of my freshman year at college. And they said, oh, we would only be interested in an article on Miss Teenage America pageant by somebody who was in the pageant. And I was not going to be in the Miss Teenage America pageant. But I really liked that girl that I was in this way. I called up the pageant offices in Fort Worth, Texas. I, called information, got their number, called them up, and I said in my most grown-up voice, "This is Joyce Maynard. I'm with 17 magazine, and I use the word we want to do a story on your pageant, but you would need to make me a judge of the pageant," which was the only way I could think that I could be part of the pageant. And they made me a judge. My mother sewed me a ball gown. She took apart an old dress of hers from the 1940s, and I flew to Fort Worth on an expense account with 17 magazine. And I wrote this story, which was not a piece of writing that I'd be proud of now. It was kind of a mean article. I made fun of these girls in ways that I would not do now. I wasn't ready to sort of locate the humanity that I now, feel is an essential quality of any character that I explore. But I wrote this article, and they took out all of what I considered my best stuff, meaning the kind of nasty little stuff like the contestant who put Vaseline on her teeth to make them shine for the TV cameras, And the article that ran in 17 was like a poor shadow of what I had delivered, in my opinion. So I took the original article and I mailed it off. I often tell this story to kids because even in these, tech savvy, big media everywhere world, I think there's still much to be learned from this. About just, if there's something you want to do, don't wait for somebody to ask you, go out and do it. So I mailed my article to the editor-in-chief of the New York Times, and darned if he didn't write back and give me an assignment. And he gave me an assignment to write the only thing that I was equipped to write about as a girl who'd grown up in a small town in New Hampshire and was 18 years old, which was me, my life. There are people who still accuse me. Just the other day, this guy came on Facebook and he said, "You're always writing about yourself. You're so self-involved." And I wrote back to him and I said, "Would you rather that I write about you?" What am I to do? Anyway, so the New York Times gave me that assignment and I wrote this story, and I was not expecting, they sent a photographer to take my picture, and I, put on my blue jeans. I don't even think I put a comb through my hair. I've lived with that photograph for 50 years. It will be the 50-year anniversary of the publication of that piece next April. But they took my picture, and 6 weeks later, there I was on the cover of the New York Times, and it did change my life in ways that, a lot of people were very resentful and angry, and why was it her, and all the things you described, although it sounds as if you were more charitable than many. And that's what inspired Salinger to write to me and got me my first book contract and led to my dropping out of college and some things that, were very poor choices at the time, but it did definitely change my life.
Can I just take up another 30 seconds?
Absolutely.
Okay, so that's the first thing, 50 years ago, the original article. Today, I go to Facebook and there's a post by you about your worker and friend, Enrique, in Guatemala.
Yes.
And I read it and I said to myself, if only this post could be read by the people who are in charge of immigration policy in the United States, because then they would understand things that they probably never thought about before. Really, I'm serious. 50 years, half a century.
I do believe that, as a person, there's a big piece of my life that is lived in Guatemala, and it's a country and a culture that is very dear to my heart, the Mayan indigenous culture of the village where I have a house and where I host my workshops. And it is painful to me to see the cost of, the men and women who leave their homes, leave their culture, leave their families. It is not to live off of, you and me. It is to basically do backbreaking work, make sacrifices that are almost indescribable, and put themselves into debt that will last for years, separate them from their children, to make a better life for their children, to send money home. And I told the story of one such man. I do a lot of, one of the things I do in addition to write is I'm kind of a building contractor, and I build a lot of stuff in Guatemala because I love to give jobs, and I'm a real believer in giving jobs. So at my property in Guatemala during the pandemic, when people were so hard hit by the end of the tourism industry in that little village, I kept a payroll of about 30 men building little, beautiful little houses on my property throughout my gardens. And now that's where I house my writing students. And sometimes people host yoga retreats there and other kinds of retreats. And very soon, Leslie and who else is coming to Guatemala? Elizabeth, you will be staying in one of those little casitas very soon. I'm looking at the clock. I'm just looking to see if, here's Tom. I am a 1953er and I have been a fan since the New York Times piece, which I identified with, and I've enjoyed your telling your story and impressed with telling your story. Also, it has been fun seeing how you have changed. Yeah, I have changed since I was 18. I bet you have too, Tom, and yet not changed. Well, we are who we are, isn't it the case? Some of my themes are exactly the same as they were when I was 18 years old. It's still sort of shocking to me to find myself 68. Yeah. I'm looking at the clock and seeing we've gone about an hour. And if there's somebody who has a burning question, I don't want to leave you in the lurch. So I will certainly address it.
I want to know what you're majoring at Yale. And I also want to know
who's talking. I'm trying to look at
Joanne. I also want to know what Charlie is doing because our children did NHDI together.
Oh, my son is still dancing, actually. My son, Charlie, is a music producer and a DJ who performs all over. Tonight he's in New York City, I think. Or no, last night he was in New York City. And he has never stopped dancing. I'm actually on hiatus from Yale. I went back to college as a sophomore when I was 65, 3 years ago, after the death of my husband, Jim. And I loved being here at Yale. It was never about the degree for me. It has never been about the degree. I just wanted to study all the things I never got to study when I was younger. But it's really expensive going to Yale. I had a full scholarship when I went in 1970. I have no scholarship now. And so when the pandemic happened, I was just not going to pay all that money to sit in front of my laptop. So I'm living in New Haven, right now, and classes do happen at Yale, but I am not an enrolled student this year because I'm working on the sequel to Count the Ways. And I don't know if I'll go back. I think my favorite part of being at college has been being around the young people. And that has been a huge education for me. They're another whole generation younger than my kids who are in their 30s and early 40s. But I loved doing this. And if I do go back, I probably won't get a degree because it would just cost too much money. So I take the minimum number of classes that I have to remain an enrolled student, and I audit the rest and don't get credit. And Carrie says, hope Enrique will do well. And I will tell you, I think it is one of the great gifts of my relationship with readers that I put out a call yesterday on Facebook to just sort of say, there's this young man. I mean, as we know, the world is full of pain and loss and sorrow and trouble. And I don't know how to address the scale of all the problems that exist. All I know to do is to find one little town, one little community, one person, and try to do some good thing for them. So when Enrique got across the border successfully the second time, and called me up in a state of shock, he could barely speak, I told his story on Facebook, and a bunch of people who had been to my workshops in Guatemala reached out and said, I'd like to help him. One woman is driving from Austin, bringing food, blankets, clothes. Ultimately, he's going to have to make his own way, and he will. He's already got a job. So thank you for asking. Thank you all for joining in today. It's the most inspiring thing I know to get me back to write the next book, to hear from readers about this one or other ones. So
And tell Meredith we missed her.
I will do that. And
I got to attend a talk of hers in Ellsworth last year.
She's
Fabulous.
read either Beneficence or her memoir.
I read them both. Yeah.
They're both wonderful books. I will deliver that word. So thank you for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thank you. It was a delight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you everyone again for joining us today. That was a very, very lovely presentation. So I will be ending it here, and we'll post the recording up on our website for everybody to see later on. And it'll also be on our YouTube channel. All right. Thank you again.